Great, everybody. Welcome to our May edition of our Eco-Districts webinar series. I'm very pleased today to be digging into the City of Chicago's approach to equitable transit-oriented development. I'll get to introductions in a moment, but thrilled that we're able to zero in on a significant body of work in Chicago that's been going on for many years, and I think work that is both really informative to our broader eco-districts community, and also the sort of reframing of transit-oriented development and redevelopment and community development with a very deep equity lens. So we're going to really dive into how key leaders and partners in the city of Chicago have put together their approach to equitable transit-oriented development. So thrilled to have you. I'm Rob Bennett. I'm the founder CEO of Eco-Districts. And per our normal webinar approach, we're going to spend the next hour in conversation. We want you all to participate in this conversation, given the limitations of technology. We're going to do this through the Q&A function on your Zoom. Many of us have gotten pretty familiar with how Zoom works, but please feel free to put your questions to the panelists, and we will have about 25 minutes at the end to get into dialogue with our panelists on the work they're doing. I will work to consolidate and curate those questions, and if you have questions that are specifically directed to people, please put that in the Q&A function as well. Today, I'm joined by Kendra Freeman of the Metropolitan Planning Council, Chandra Christman-Rouse from Enterprise, and Juan Sebastian Arias from the city's mayor's office of Lori Lightfoot. We're going to dive in specifically into their bios in a moment. I just wanted to thank the city of Chicago, the Metropolitan Planning Council in Chicago, Enterprise, a long-standing partner of ours, the Bullitt Foundation, Rethink, and the Kresge Foundation for the funding and the support to be able to put on this webinar series. We've been doing this for over a year and a half, and it's really been a great opportunity to introduce people to key leaders through the region. So for introductory purposes, we've got a panel today that is really at the center of the work to advance equitable transit-oriented development in the city of Chicago and the region. Unlike most of our webinars where we tend to have a single speaker, we have a panel of speakers today, and I think it's important in the case of this work to be able to do that, because each of the three of them represent key stakeholders and key leaders, leadership positions to sort of advance the work. And as we talk about in the opening description, collaboration sort of at the heart of this work. So Kendra Freeman, who is the vice president at the Metropolitan Planning Council, she provides oversight to MPC's programs and guides the organization's approach to community engagement in both research, policy advocacy, and technical assistance. As a MPO, they're really providing that planning framework, that kind of regional coordination across planning issues in which transit-oriented development is a key function and priority of the region and the city. Juan Sebastian has moved and collaborated with Kendra at the MPC at Enterprise, and now sitting in Mayor Lori Lightfoot's office as the Deputy Director of Policy. Juan Sebastian's role is really to help advance the policy framework for equitable transit development, among other parts of his portfolio in the areas of food security, housing, and neighborhood development. And then finally, Chandra Christmas-Rouse, who is a program officer at Enterprise. She is helping to coordinate the efforts as a partner in one of the country's largest national intermediaries that helps focus on advancing community development and affordable housing. And she leads the program policy and capital initiatives with local partners that focus on the environmental resilience, the equitable TOD, and healing-centered engagement in the work. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kendra. And again, if you've got questions, put them in the chat, and we'll take them after their presentation. Welcome, Kendra.
Thanks, Rob. I'm really excited to have two colleagues join me on the panel, Juan Sebastian and Chandra, people who I just so enjoy working with and respect so much, to have this conversation about collaboration around ETOD in Chicago. You can go to the next slide, please. Next slide. We're going to kind of tag team this a little bit. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about how we've approached ETOD in Chicago in the last 4 years or so. Juan Sebastian is going to talk more about from the city's perspective on implementation, and Chandra is going to talk about how the collaborative has been using equity tools to really help shape the allocation of resources that support development projects in the city. So a little bit about Metropolitan Planning Council. We've been around since 1934, and MPC is the independent change-making organization that really works to build a better, more equitable future for everyone who lives in the Chicago region. So we seek to make positive change by defining problems through research, using collaborative advocacy to develop and advance solutions. We work to shift narratives through strategic communication. We try to bounce numbers and narratives through that. And often we provide technical assistance to partners to help jumpstart implementation through piloting interventions. We're also one of the founding members of Elevated Chicago, which is a 4-year-old collaborative that's focused on advancing equitable TOD with a focus on racial equity, climate resilience, and improving health outcomes throughout the city. And our work is focused there around 7 transit stations across the city of Chicago. So, and under that umbrella, we've been working for the last 4 years to really center community voice and equitable policy and TOD. A little bit about what we mean when we talk about equitable transit-oriented development. So ETOD for us is about connecting communities and people through transit and really doing development that puts people first and seeking to reduce social and economic gaps, as well as supporting social and economic resilience that benefits a wide range of people. Chicago's ETOD policy plan really, I think, seeks to center racial equity and develop in transit-served locations. And I think we try to be, the collaborative, when I say we try to be really explicit in using language that really highlighted who would benefit from this plan, really focusing on how can we create pathways to close economic gaps between communities of color, and really try to intentionally pivot from using race-neutral policies that we typically see. And traditionally, the ETOD policy has been pretty generic over time. Next slide. Yeah, you can click through both of those maps, please. So just to give you a little bit of background, the interconnected and complex challenges that we face as a region in Chicago have real human impacts. And one of those challenges is and continues to be our legacy of racial and economic segregation. It impacts our housing markets, access to education, ability to build wealth, access to jobs and resources, as well as how investment dollars flow or how they don't flow into neighborhoods. And these maps illustrate where white, African-American, and Latino populations live across the region. The left map is the one of Chicago. And then we also added a map of Houston just to give a comparison point. Each dot represents about 1,000 people. And the red dots represent white population, blue dots represent African-American population, and green dots represent Latino population. And you could just see the kind of tight, more pronounced patterns of segregation when you look at the map on the left, where you see very strong clusters of blue, very strong clusters of red, and very strong clusters of green. Even though you do have some dissipation when you look out in the broader Chicagoland area, it's still very tight as compared to Houston, where there's still, very defined areas of segregation, but they're more at a moderate level of segregation. So you see a little bit of nuance there. And I often like to think about it or describe it as, if you've ever been to Chicago and you take a thoroughfare like Halsted or Ashland and you start at the northernmost point, you will see like a continuum of mainly white communities, and then you'll get to the central area and you'll see a little bit of diversity. And once you get maybe about 47th Street all the way out to the city limits, which is like 130th Street, is almost completely African-American. So there's some really stark ways that our segregation shows up and impacts us. Next slide. So in 2017, the Metropolitan Planning Council released the Cost of Segregation Research Study. And we really tried to dig into this question of what is it costing our region to live so separately by income and by race. So we measured Black and white segregation, we measured Latino white segregation, and we measured economic segregation. And we worked with the Urban Institute to crunch the numbers for 100 of the largest metropolitan areas in order to determine a median point and compare what the Chicago region might look like and what we might expect to see if our levels of segregation just came down to that median level. So what we found was, first, the Chicago region as a whole was 5th ranked highest as far as racial and economic segregation combined. And then the main kind of consequences of that has been lost income, lost lives, and lost potential. So lost income, the region as a whole would earn, we would expect to see the region would earn about 4.4 billion more in annual income, with being at that moderate level of segregation. Lost lives, we would expect to see a drop in our homicide rate of about 30% if we were at that median income. And lost potential, we would expect to see higher educational attainment at the bachelor's degree level, just to give you some context. Next slide. So this is why we need to be explicit about racial equity in TOD. Policies that are market driven are also driven by our legacy of segregation and equities that are largely defined by race and income. There's been decades of extracting wealth from communities of color through predatory lending, redlining. Strategic disinvestment has also stifled growth and prosperity of many viable transit-served neighborhoods, particularly on the south and west sides. And that's only been amplified, as we've seen in the last year, by the impacts of COVID-19, as well as the country's racial reckoning. The maps that you see here show where TOD activity has been happening across the city of Chicago. So again, you see kind of a pattern of projects happening around the central business district and going north, and just a few dots on the south and west side areas. So in addition to where TOD activity has actually happened, we've also seen an increase of about 18% of the increase in rents in those areas. And in some cases, that's either triggered or catalyzed displacement for moderate and low income residents and businesses in areas that's been transitioning. The other challenge with the historic TOD ordinance, which was enacted in 2013, is it's been kind of like a menu situation. So the developers can pick and choose which incentives that they like to use, which is not all bad. But the pattern we've typically seen is developers will take parking reductions, which is very attractive to developers because parking is really expensive and it lowers the overall cost of the project. So you could take that parking reduction under the ordinance. But there's also a density bonus that also triggers the city's inclusionary housing ordinance and actually increases the amount of affordable housing that would be required on the site. And we don't see that being enacted as much in TOD areas or TOD eligible projects. And of course, if you're building as of right, there's no requirement to do any affordability, which in many cases is really needed when you're looking at communities that are transitioning. Next slide. So in 2019, the City Council passed an update to the TOD ordinance, and that essentially added benefits to 24 high ridership bus routes, and that increased eligible parcels across the city by about 64%. And this was started by the previous administration, and the intent was really to use TOD as a vehicle for economic development, which we also think TOD is a great vehicle for economic development, but we also know from past performance that doesn't happen just by simply expanding the eligible area for TOD. You really have to think about what is hindering development in other places. So when the previous administration was thinking about how do we do this and how can we improve the ordinance, because of the work that we have been doing with the city, MPC and Elevated Chicago, they came to us and said, well, help us think about this. And we said, essentially, this is a good start, but we need to do more. And so we worked with the city over a very small window of time to craft some language to also add to the ordinance. And as a result, there was an amendment added to that ordinance that passed in 2019 that included a directive for the city to complete an analysis of projects utilizing the incentives over the past 5 years to really understand what's happening and to quantify that. and also work to establish performance measures. And what I think is probably the most important part of this is to give the city a mandate to create an equity-centered plan to inform further revision and implementation of TOD across the city. So in 2019, essentially that started an 18-month clock for the city to create this plan. And MPC and Elevate Chicago worked really closely with the city in helping them think about how do we move forward. And there were a lot of challenges in that. We started with a really small group of people, close partners, to kind of think about what the process is. We had a mayoral transition in there. We had a pandemic in there. But despite, some of those challenges, we were still able to expand the group of stakeholders to about 80 or so representatives from different neighborhoods representing, different aspects of the development spectrum, particularly neighborhoods that were newly impacted by the ETOD ordinance, to come together and really work on recommendations to build out the policy plan. And that was shared for public comment in September 2020. And the city is now in the position of really taking some of the short-term priorities and moving towards the next phase of implementation. Next slide. So before I turn it over to Juan Sebastian, I just wanted to highlight a couple of the buckets that are the key strategic priorities of the plan. First, in looking at building the city's capacity to support ETOD, making ETOD easier, and also embedding the principles into the broader citywide planning process. There were over 50 recommendations, and they were vetted using an evaluation criteria that looked at equity impacts, that looked at implementation and feasibility impact. And there were 7 core outcomes that we tried to align the principles of the plan around, which were anti-displacement, community reinvestment, climate resilience, desegregation, economic growth and recovery, health equity, and wealth building. So with that, I will pass it over to my colleague Juan Sebastian to talk a little bit more detail about the work that he's doing in leading implementation.
Thank you, Kendra, and also grateful for the opportunity to be here and to share with you all some more about how we're collaborating and working across sectors and across agencies to advance ETOD. So I'll pretty much pick up the ball, or pick up the story from where Kendra left off. Again, I'm Juan Sebastian Arias with the Mayor's Office policy team, and I've been in the role for just a little under a year. If we go next to the next slide, as Kendra mentioned, we put up the draft of this ETOD policy plan last fall, had a 45-day public comment period, are getting ready to hit a couple of milestones in the next coming months, including putting up a final version of the policy plan, which incorporates public comment, as well as launching some new or a new program, which I'm going to be talking about for a bit later on. But as a part of this all, what we've been focusing on over the last several months too is in this general shift from the actual planning work, or the identification of our recommendations that are part of the policy plan, to actually implement it. And so I wanted to take at least a couple minutes or moments to talk about the ETOD working group itself, which, as Kendra showed on that one slide with the timeline, had its start back in January 2019 and evolved over the course of those 18 months while we put together the plan. Now that we have pretty much gotten to a final policy plan, one of the first questions, and actually one of the recommendations within the plan itself, was to formalize that group. So as we've been moving or thinking about how to transition from planning to implementation, we re-looked at the ETOD working group again, because of all the benefit that we got from convening the group and having neighborhood organizations, having our civic partners, having stakeholders from across sectors inform the policy plan. We knew that we wanted to keep it going, to transition from that ad hoc working group that came together to form the policy plan to actually be a standing body that helps support implementation and provide some accountability to make sure that we're actually living up to or making progress on the many 30+ recommendations that are included in the policy plan. As a part of that, we also we looked at the list of stakeholders. Actually, we also got some feedback on this in the public comment period too, in order to be able to identify what are some of the gaps in terms of members that we should have in the working group, and how can we start filling those. So if we go to the next slide, just a little bit of a preview or like a snapshot of the kinds of organizations and some examples of who's a part of this table. A couple of the additions that we did make based on feedback was to include some more of the regional transportation agencies, which are now part of the work group. We've identified a couple additional neighborhoods that we wanted to make sure were represented, including those that are going to be part of future transit investments. So I'm thinking of the Red Line Extension South in Chicago. And then also work to add some more developer perspectives too, which was also brought out during the public comment process, especially as we think about changes that we want to make to the city's TOD or what we call our Transit Served Location TSL ordinance. In line with this policy plan, we want to make sure that we're also getting some of that perspective from the developer community as well. So from the 80 plus folks that became a part of this work group last year, as we were developing the policy plan, we've sort of restarted or refreshed membership. So now we're about a list of about 30 groups, 30 representatives that are part of the work group itself too. And then just like a small note also about how we've structured this, we have this larger ETOD work group, or this 30 plus member ETOD work group. And then we do have a smaller core planning and coordinating team that includes myself from the mayor's office, also folks from our planning and development department and our Department of Housing, as well as Elevate Chicago and PC, Kendra, and a few others too. One last thing I'll say about this piece that I think I've been encouraged to see as a practice being adopted more often across the city of Chicago at least, is that because of our partnership with Elevated Chicago, we were also able to provide stipends to compensate the community-based organizations for their participation in the work group. And that's actually something that is becoming more common practice across other work groups that the city's currently setting up or that already convenes. And I think it's an important part of also the equity lens that we want to bring to all this, to make sure that we're also resourcing especially smaller community-based organizations that are BIPOC led, that we are asking their time. And so we want to make sure that we're also compensating for that, giving them the resources for that too. So that's also something that I think was very core and integral to this as well. If we go to the next slide, I can share a little bit more also about what some of the roles are for the working group members themselves. As we transition from the planning to implementation, we want this group to really help monitor that, to help track and hold us accountable to implementing the policy recommendations. We want the members to play a role in identifying pilots and demonstration projects, which I'll say a little bit more about in just a bit. And then also to help support the implementation of recommendations. So for example, I've mentioned a couple times some of the work that we're going to be doing to incorporate the recommendations into our TOD ordinance. So that's an example of where we're gonna tap the work group itself too, to help us further refine and flesh out, building on the recommendations, the specific like legislative agenda that we'll have for this overall effort. And then more broadly, of course, we couldn't do all this work without additional resources for implementation. So and support with identifying those or fundraising, and then also in general, just being an ambassador of ETOD and the policy plan with the many different coalitions, communities, and networks that all the working group members represent. Then if we go to the next slide, I can go over, these are just a select few of the recommendations that are part of the policy plan, which will be finalized and posted later or next month, actually right after Memorial Day. So just in a couple weeks. Anyway, these are a few of the priorities that we have in the short term. So I mentioned this this demonstration and pilot project program, which we are also gearing up to launch in the next coming weeks, and I'll again say a little bit more about that in a bit. Another one that I want to highlight is around around developing and incorporating a health and racial equity impact assessment into some efforts that the city is also undertaking, launching a citywide plan, which Chicago is doing for the first time in over 50 years, this kind of a comprehensive citywide planning process. Then, as I've mentioned, we're also looking to make further updates to our current zoning code that has a TOD ordinance. I think Kendra mentioned a few of the principles that are, or a few of the recommendations that are part of this, and these are all part of the policy plan itself as well. But that includes expanding the universe of eligible parcels so that we have a universal half-mile radius for developments to be able to qualify for some TOD incentives, such as reduced parking or increased density. We want to incorporate some more mechanisms, or we're exploring ways that we can promote more affordability or more affordable housing, in particular near transit, and especially in higher cost or more exclusionary parts of the city. We also want to incorporate some more specifics around design and use guidelines. So thinking more about what are the kinds of uses that we want to promote or discourage near transit. So more auto-oriented uses, gas stations, et cetera. That's just a couple of the things that we're looking at incorporating or looking at including as a part of our future ordinance changes, which is part of the implementation of this whole entire plan too. The other couple things that I'll mention are one of the big goals that we do have with our ETOD plan itself is around driving some more investment and development near transit in south and west sides of Chicago, which have been historically disinvested. And one of the assets that we do have as a city is around a large inventory of city-owned public land, city-owned vacant lots, which we also are working to develop a strategy around how to leverage those for greater development opportunities and to make sure that those are actually, that those lots are able to contribute to some public benefit. Again, keeping in mind these questions of who benefits and who burdens, and how can we make sure that that's racially equitable too. The last two short-term priorities that are listed on here are related to some of our housing policy, and Chandra is actually going to talk a little bit more about the last one around the qualified allocation plan, which is how we allocate our low-income housing tax credits. So I'll let her go into that one in a lot more detail, but these two represent some of our priorities around back to the earlier point about creating some preferences or strengthening some linkages for affordable housing to be built near transit. Both the improvements that we made to the ARO, the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, which is Chicago's inclusionary zoning policy, and then also our QAP are important pieces of that. And as you might be able to see just from going over this list of just a handful of our short-term priorities, there's like an immense need for coordination, not just across city departments, which there's already a lot that are a part of all these efforts. I mentioned planning development, I mentioned housing, transportation is also a big, is also obviously a big leader in this or critical stakeholder. The CTAs, our Chicago Transit Authority, the Public Health Department, that's all just on the city side, which takes a lot of intention around coordinating and making sure that we're aligned and moving forward on these, all of these priorities. And that's outside of also the external groups we want to make sure we're working with, and the community residents and neighborhood leaders that are core to anything that we do around equitable policy or equitable development. As we've, I think, mentioned before, right? But part of how we see equity too within TOD, but outside, is both as a process and as an outcome as well. So we are trying to make sure that we're paying attention to the process of this all as well. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about this pilots and demonstration program that we've mentioned, which is part of our one of our more immediate recommendation priorities that we're going to be advancing in the next month. And so what we're essentially doing in a nutshell is launching this piloted demonstration program where we want to test the recommendations in the policy plan. We want to rally some resources and technical assistance around 5 to 10 community-driven ETOD projects. And we're open to a variety of different kinds of projects, both in terms of where they are in their development stage, but also not just thinking about affordable housing near transit, but also thinking about other economic development investments, other complete streets or walkability or accessibility improvements near transit, public art interventions, etc. And part of our goal for this overall pilot and demonstration program as well is around the prioritization of community-driven submissions, having an open call for proposals. And actually, we go to the next slide. I can just keep, I can make the bridge here, but having an open call for proposals that is selected through. Actually, if we go to the next slide, maybe we'll come back to this one. So this is a little bit. This is a process that we're going to be going through in the coming months. Mostly designed closely with the ETOD work group members and with the goal of setting up a more transparent, collaborative, and open process to identifying projects that the city and our partners rally some support around. So we are creating the selection committee that's comprised of both city and non-city folks who will help review applications. We're going to have an open call for proposals, do this in 2 stages, but essentially put out an open call for any ETOD projects to be submitted. And then once we are able to review and select some, we will be providing, and actually if we go back to the previous slide, we will be providing some modest grant support, and mostly some additional technical assistance. And so this will definitely vary quite a bit across what kinds of projects end up being submitted as pilots or demonstrations. But from the city side, we do want to help do what we can to navigate, our existing processes or bureaucracies, connect to other funding opportunities, and really just champion and bring support to those pilots however we can. Similarly, our partners at Elevated Chicago, at Enterprise, at MPC are also looking at ways that they can support pilot projects themselves too. But I wanted to highlight this or call this out as a new way of working for the city that I know I'm personally very excited about launching, to be able to make these, to be able to identify pilots in a way that is sharing some of that decision-making power with our partners across the ETOD work group, and do that in an open way. So I think if we just go over to the next slides, I think that might be it for me. Oh, the last thing I'll share is that we have also worked with the ETOD work group to develop the criteria that we want to use for selecting the pilots. And this is just a pretty high level summary of what those are, looking at feasibility, equity, alignment, and transit orientation. So much more to come. I think I'm gonna pass it over now to Chandra, who's gonna discuss a little bit more one of the priorities that I mentioned earlier on the QAP, but which also represents part of the implementation efforts that we're doing around how we can actually begin to change funding streams or prioritize ETOD within city funding.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Again, my name is Chandra Kristen-Strauss, and I'm a program officer at Enterprise Community Partners, and excited to share with you all one tool to creating more equitable change, and that's through the racial equity impact assessment work that I've been doing in partnership with the City of Chicago's Department of Housing. And so if we go to the next slide, I just first wanted to ground us in the language that I'll be using and really thinking about racial equity as both a process and an outcome. So starting with how are we acknowledging history, recognizing that there's no way forward unless we tell the truth about how we got here, and understanding how the current conditions we see are born out of a long legacy and continuation of structural racism. Next, thinking about how are we shifting power, and this includes how we think about historical understandings of power, but also how we're amplifying and lifting up power that already exists within communities. And so what does that work look like? And lastly, how are we thinking about accountability to then anchor this work onto particular outcomes, and what is the data that we're using to talk through that work? Next slide. And so we recognize that these problems that we all spoke about exist within systems, and that there's organizations and institutions that uphold and perpetuate systemic inequities. And so the work of the racial equity impact assessment really focuses on the structural part and thinking about institutions and systemic issues. And so part of this is thinking about how we have to work differently for the systems that we're a part of to begin to shift. And so focusing on this particular level of racism. Next slide. Next, wanted to walk through the steps of what this process has looked like. So it began with identifying what is the actual goal, what is the actual lever we're trying to pull with this work, and developing our objectives. Next, thinking about what has data shown historically and current conditions around this, and what is data that we still need to collect to increase accountability for this work. We also conducted focus groups with different stakeholders, in which we had a survey of questions, really trying to understand who has been burdened and who benefits from this work, and where there might be disproportionately those benefiting or burdening, and how do we begin to approach different stakeholders in that work. There was an extensive part around community engagement and how we define who gets to lead that work, and how are we intentionally creating spaces for different voices to come to the table as we discuss what the next phase around recommendations looks like. And so not only is there the reporting out of the findings, but how are we then using that to inform structural change that we seek to see? And then lastly, thinking about what is the larger impact of this work, and how are we measuring progress, and beginning to think about what meaningful changes we can do with this work. Next slide. And so at its core, this work is really about how we can ask different questions. And so thinking about the community stakeholders to be better informed, engaged, and equipped to think about accountability and be able to dismantle structures that no longer serve the needs that we're seeing, and what the data has informed us, as we heard from the research that Kendra spoke about, and then for policymakers to begin to have the training and support needed in executing on these more inclusive policies that Juan Sebastian lifted up. And so all of this is about how we reckon with history, how we shift power and make more space for accountability. Next slide. And so the core question that we were tackling with this tool was around how can we use the QAP to make LIHTC application process and ultimately awards more racially equitable and ensure more opportunities for community wealth building. And so again, just highlighting exactly what each of these processes are. First, the low-income housing tax credit program is designed to provide incentives for the private sector to develop affordable rental housing. And then the qualified allocation plan, known as QAP, is a set of instructions that the Department of Housing puts out to guide LIHTC developers through this process of acquiring tax credits for producing affordable rental units. And so this is just to lift up some of the levers that we are looking to pull as a part of this work, and thinking about who is served by this. And so how are we looking at reporting, demographic data, sizes of units. Next, we're looking at who is served by this and how they're served by it. And so what are the wraparound services that need to be incentivized that really center the well-being of the end users and residents in these units. Also thinking about geographically, we heard about segregation, and so where are these units being developed and preserved, and how are we weighing different goals as a part of that? And lastly, as we think about shifting power, who is involved, and what does that participation look like in terms of addressing barriers to access for developers or service providers, and and increasing BIPOC participation. Next slide. And so wanted to next highlight past LIHTC projects in the city. And so LIHTC is the primary source of funding for new construction and preservation of affordable housing over the past 20 years. In particular, it's preserved around 10,000 low-income units. And last year's or 2019 cycle in particular, we're focused on 3 different market types. And so you see highlighted here is around transitioning neighborhoods to ensure stability of diverse communities, but it also included opportunity areas as well as revitalized neighborhoods. And also wanted to highlight some of the data around who are the tenants within these units and which demographics are more overwhelmingly represented. And so you see the Black population here and how that compares to their percentage in the city. And so thinking about who actually lives in these properties and how that compares to the white and Latinx populations that are underrepresented based on population data. Next slide. Next, wanted to highlight some of the findings from our work around data. And the first is that majority of the LIHTC units are new construction and located within high poverty areas. About a quarter of them with between 2000 and 2017 were in opportunity areas. And there was also themes that came up around insufficient units to meet larger household sizes, particularly within Latinx populations and neighborhoods. And lastly, just again, highlighting how Black residents make up almost 67% of LIHTC tenants, but are about 41% of Chicago households in poverty, and how that compares to other minority groups. Next slide. And so as I mentioned, racial equity is not only an outcome in the data findings that I shared, but also in how we talk about this data and the stories that we lift up. And so a part of this report, I wanted to ensure that not only the information that we're presenting is accessible, but the mediums in which we are using are also accessible through design and language. And so these 6 characters were a part of the narratives that I created to report out what our recommendations were. And all of their stories weave within each other about all the different community members of Chicago that touch the QAP process. And so Joe and Brandon are LIHTC developers that are considering entering a joint venture. Tony, you see here, is a property manager that works primarily with a Spanish-speaking population, and she herself does not speak Spanish. And then Isabel and Luis are residents in a Latinx community that are navigating the LIHTC program and thinking about mental health considerations and elderly relatives that they have to care for. And Randy himself is the elder in the community and is wondering about, how this work is connecting to larger wealth building and access to home ownership. Next slide. And so wanted to highlight the recommendations that are listed up in each of these characters' stories and how all of the lived experience that we learned about through the different focus groups are really grounding how we identified these themes. And so the first is around BIPOC participation and benefits through acting as a service provider and developer. We looked at creating production targets for particular subpopulations based on need, improving access to units for marginalized communities, also how we're coordinating housing with other neighborhood amenities. So in this case, thinking about transit and how can the work of the ETOD policy plan fit into this. Thinking also about engagement and management standards to ensure quality units. And then also kind of branching beyond rental housing itself, how is it connecting to larger opportunities for wealth building? And then lastly, creating more accessible, family-friendly homes, and also the application process and thinking about wraparound services as it relates to mental health. Next slide. And so I wanted to conclude with a few lessons learned that have been most impactful for me as doing this work. And so the first is around how we were able to prioritize process and facilitate trust building. And so as I mentioned, a lot of this work begins with first acknowledging the power dynamics of what it would mean to bring all these various stakeholder groups into conversation with each other. And so how can we create intentional spaces for more meaningful engagement as a part of the focus groups that I spoke about. Next, thinking about how solutions will be insufficient if they are not intersectional, and that we have to put people first enough to consider the ways that affordable housing shows up differently for everyone, and how someone might also be a resident, but they're a commuter, and how are they accessing their jobs in an affordable way. And so all of these other identifiers that we have, how are our solutions then reflecting the multitude of identities that we have. And then lastly, going back to the narratives that I spoke of with the fictional characters, really taking the direct quotes from residents and those focus groups to center those most marginalized, and ultimately how the strategies we create when we center those most marginalized residents work for everyone. And so how are we thinking about the full arc of this work, where it doesn't just stop at the outcomes, but we're always thinking about how we can invite more readers in by reflecting back the lived experience of folks and using accessible design and storytelling techniques, and excluding folks around technical jargon. And so I'm excited to get into conversation with my incredible colleagues about all of the threads of our work, and I'll pass it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you all, Chandra, Kendra, and Juan Sebastian. There is a tremendous amount of questions. This is a very meaty presentation with lots of lots of threads around policy development, policy oversight, actually activating QAPs and the racial equity impact assessment work. So let's get into it. There is a broad set of questions, in essence, about the kind of goals and impacts of the ETOD work today, and specifically whether or not the work to date has got a specific set of goals and objectives around how TOD or ETOD shows up in the South Side, predominantly Black communities, in contrast to the more North and Northwest communities that have seen a lot of the investment to date. So can each of you, and I'm not sure who wants to take this question, if you want to sort of all talk about it, but how is this work really sort of hitting the ground in the context of that broader sort of story that Kendra started with around racial segregation, concentration of poverty, and how ETOD sort of looks, moving forward, given the sort of the trend towards much of it being in the North and Northwest.
I can start off, and then, of course, welcome Kendra, Chandra to jump in too. But I think it's a good question, and very much a core part of the goals that we have for the ETOD, our ETOD work and the ETOD policy plan. I would say, very much that given the history and the context of Chicago's, very deeply racially and socioeconomically entrenched segregation, in the city, a lot of the approach for ETOD, we are imagining, or we are expecting to have to be tailored to each neighborhood itself, right? And so what that means is that a big priority is around how we can drive some investment or development near transit to help foster healthier, mixed use, pedestrian oriented development near transit in the South and West Sides. Whereas in some neighborhoods, for those who are familiar with Chicago, for example, like Logan Square, Pilsen, which are more historically Latinx and have been seeing some rapid investment and displacement pressures, that also means prioritizing affordability and preventing displacement through gentrification in those areas as well. But I think back to your question, that how this shows up in the majority Black neighborhoods of South and West Side Chicago is a very much core part of this, and part of what we're thinking through in terms of our legislative changes we might make to the TOD ordinance, but also to what other kinds of incentives or programs that we have. Things like, again, I mentioned our vacant lot inventory earlier as one particular asset that we can leverage. But we're very much, exploring all these different paths and open to other suggestions as well. But again, to your question, that is very much core of what we want to accomplish is to not have, is to in 10 years from now, or maybe even 5 years from now, to look at a map of a TOD development across the city and not see it so concentrated in areas where there's already development happening.
Yeah, I guess I would just throw in that the ETOD ordinance in and of itself, or the plan, is not going to solve this by itself. It has to be a layering of things. And I think this is really, and that's why I'm so glad Juan Sebastian is in the position he is, because he's kind of like at the center of a number of different things that all are like puzzle pieces, and making sure that we get not just prioritizing resources around transit served areas, but also how do we think about how affordable housing is cited. For a long time, the city was just like, okay, pitch us, where do you want to do a project, developer? And developers go, in disinvested areas, well, this is where it's cheap, this is where I can get some site access. And they're not thinking about all these other issues about access to transit and access to resources, and how, potentially a project can bring economic development or strengthen a commercial corridor. So I think it's important to think about how we bring all of those pieces together through various policies. And I think the city has done some things with the QAP, and they've done something with the inclusionary housing policy that's starting to bring all those pieces together in a way that hopefully makes a lot more sense. But at the end of the day, I think it's what Juan Sebastian said, is the recognition that this is not a one size fits all thing. And so we're going to have to really, I think, have those local, hyper-local conversations with community, and making sure when there is opportunity for development around transit, that we understand, like, what are the specific needs and challenges of that community, and what's going to make that work in the long term. Like, what are the resources, who are the partners, what is the catalytic development that's really going to be best for this community? Because catalytic investment at 95th and State may look a whole lot different than what it looks like in Logan Square.
Thank you. There's a series of questions that I think I'm going to try to pull together around the broader context of the neighborhoods or the communities that these transit-oriented sites sit in. Can you talk about how the ETOD work, and I think, Chandra, to your racial equity impact assessment, how is it informing the broader neighborhood planning that the city might be doing, or community development efforts in a neighborhood that will be stimulated, activated, or potentially negatively impacted by development around the transit sites?
Yeah, I would just start with kind of the relationship building piece to even get to the point of having these focus groups, was how can this work be of service to those types of anti-displacement efforts or kind of larger advocacy campaigns. And so a lot of the dialogue that we facilitated was, some of it was exclusively about the QAP work, but other parts of it was just broadly, what are all the other the systems that this touches, and how can we actually shift power so that those communities can be in control of what future development looks like. And then how are we connecting the dots with other systems, like education was something that came up, or workforce development. And so kind of while the conversation started with housing, I think it became much more broad around what does coalition building look like when you're looking at the intersection of multiple systems that touch on where developments are being sited near transit.
Great. And Juan, is there anything to add around the sort of how the ETOD work is impacting the city's approach to neighborhood scale planning? Is it sort of nested and layered? Is there additional kind of activity that this is prompting?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think one of the timely one of the things that have kind of worked out for us to be well aligned is around the citywide planning process that I mentioned that the city is currently embarking on. We don't often do a lot of neighborhood level planning itself, but part of what we are hoping comes out of the citywide plan process is some better standards for how that happens. And I think thankfully, because we went through this development of this ETOD or ETOD policy plan before that, this is very much, before embarking on this citywide planning process, it is very much part of what everyone has in mind that we need to keep at the forefront of all those conversations too. So I think there is definitely more work that needs to be done around some of the neighborhood planning scale stuff, though the city of Chicago as a practice, not historically done that comprehensively across all neighborhoods, though that is a direction that we are hoping to go in. And I think, again, the fact that we developed all these recommendations right as the city's entering like a more public phase of our citywide planning process is a good opportunity for us to make sure that it's included in that.
Great. I'm gonna finish. We have 4 minutes. Series of questions kind of around the pilot program and what sort of expectations and how it will work. Juan Sebastian, you touched on sort of the process, but one of the questions I think maybe can get to that is sort of traditionally TOD centering around market interest and investments in corridor development. So sort of lifting up more development, higher dense mixed use, mixed income housing, retail, et cetera, around transit. How will ETOD, the question here is, how will ETOD attract development in disinvested areas without displacing residents if the policy is innately developer driven, and traditionally TOD is? Has there been any successful examples of this? So to the extent that you know of successful examples or your pilot program, paint us a picture of what you think success will look like, in the next 2 or 3 years with the pilot program.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question because it gets to the crux of of one of the problems that we're trying to solve. I don't know if I have seen great or perfect examples of this. I part of the vision is that through this pilot program, we will be able to support community driven, and I think these are all going to be or are part of the criteria that we're developing for the selection of the pilots, but for potential pilots to be community driven, to be proposed by groups working in neighborhoods where they're proposing these projects. And part of the vision, right, is that supporting those kinds of projects will hopefully help mitigate against some of the potential for displacement. But that's also, I think there's definitely more work aside from just the pilots themselves that will need to go into preventing displacement or tackling some of these larger issues, which is why we also have some more policy-oriented recommendations aside from just the pilot program itself. But just to give you an example, just to give a couple of examples of what I imagine are going to be some kinds of pilot projects. There are a number of walkability assessments that were done in some of the transit adjacent neighborhoods across the city that identified walkability or accessibility improvements that need to be made. So more in the pedestrian infrastructure side of a category of pilots. Then of course, there's also more of the traditional sort of development, more affordable or denser development near transit as well. I think there's some clear opportunities across the city, such as the 95th Red Line train station, which just received some big investments to renovate it, to make it a more attractive station as well, which also I think presents an opportunity, as well as future train line investments that we do currently have, such as that are being developed, such as the Red Line extension too.
Great, thank you. We're at the hour, and unfortunately, there's so many more questions. We will do our best here at Eco Districts to capture some of those questions and try to get some of those answers from our panelists so that we can continue the conversation offline. I do want to mention, I think that the sort of precise work that that Chandra, you and your team work on around centering healing, and that the new toolkit that you've created for that, and obviously the green communities criteria, the QAP work, that sort of finer grain work around really activating, around the issues and the larger goals of equitable development. That's a whole other conversation I'd love to be able to get into with you at some other time. But thank you again, Kendra, Juan Sebastian, Chandra, for this conversation. I think it's really important to recognize that the city of Chicago is doing some really groundbreaking work, and that other cities are learning a lot from what's going on in Chicago. So I know there's a lot of transit authorities, MPOs, city agencies, and community development intermediaries are looking to figure out how to move this more aggressively across the country. At Eco Districts, obviously, we are in the business of promoting community-driven, equitable, and sustainable development projects. So this work and the role that transit-oriented development plays as catalyzing broader community sustainability and equitable development practices is hugely important. So we're really honored to have you all with us. Make sure we will get in the links, the tools that I mentioned, including the ETOD policy framework that I guess will be out coming off of the public comment period, will be live shortly. We'll make sure we get all that to the rest of you. Again, thank you to the three of you for taking the hour with us, and to all of us on the line. We'll see you next time. Thanks again.
Thanks, Rob.